Hello everyone, today we talk about 13th century Hungarian knights. Quite specific, we never talked about Hungarian warfare before. This is really the first time, and I think we can give a broader introduction to Hungarian warfare between essentially the low Middle Ages. We will space from essentially the 12th to the 14th century, but being concentrated in the central 13th. And then we will observe, of course, what a stereotypical Hungarian knight of the time would look like, meant as a milis, right, as the heavily armored cavalrymen. As we will see, there were naturally many other typologies, but in the case of Hungary especially, great diversity deriving from the essentially multicultural character of what has been defined effectively not even as a kingdom in actual fact, but as an empire, because it really encompassed large areas of Central Europe and really controlling peoples of diverse ethnic background, others actually even pouring in after the same establishment of the Hungarian kingdom proper. In a character of territorial domination that probably in Hungary did resemble a lot the original one of the steppes from which the Magyars had come from, that in the political and institutional culture of the kingdom was revived. And naturally, the history of Hungary, especially during the 13th century, is quite complex. There is massive event constituted by the Mongol invasions that eventually will actually annihilate the Hungarian forces that stood to stop them, but that didn't encompass Hungary. That is effectively the westernmost areas of the Eurasian steppes, right? So. Eventually, especially during the Angevin period, Hungary was reshaped. It recovered pretty fast, and it was reshaped in this kind of, for the time, actually very centralized kingdom on this more Western models that, however, had poured in Hungarian, politics and society, and that in fact, especially during the 13th century, even before the Mongol invasion and later developments, actually were already very strong, right? But there were also other elements, as we will see now, that were present at the same time. So, as we have just stated, the medieval Hungarian state was very large, right? It included many provinces inhabited by non-Magyar peoples, though some of these latter areas did have substantial Hungarian minorities, sometimes even garrisons, as you can imagine, for territorial control. Many cities during this period also included substantial German minorities. It could even be considered as German islands, fundamentally set into this Hungarian sea, right? And in fact, the imperial character of Hungary, as we have stressed, is quite evident, right? The most non-important major regions aside from the Pannonian Basin, where they had settled, like the Huns, like the Hammers had done, that was functional to this, essentially to maintain the political and military systems that had characterized these peoples when they were in the Eurasian steppes, right? And so pastures, the steppes, right? And this favored in part the continuity of certain military models of the steppes that were revived over time. But these waves of refugees coming, especially from the Mongol invasions and fleeing in Hungary and also in other countries in Central and Balkanic Europe. And the major non-Magyar regions in this regard were Transylvania, that had essentially a mixed Hungarian, Romanian, and German population. The Zips, that was this area of Slovakia, Ruthenia fundamentally, then Croatia, Bosnia, Temesvar, this is northern Serbia, and northern Dalmatia. These were had been essentially Byzantine dominated areas that the Hungarian state came to incorporate, obviously with partly the centralized domination, but effectively so, and absorbing influences even from these areas, right? And being in contact even with the Adriatic Sea, with the Italian, especially the City republics, especially with Venice, famously. Which warfare would in fact escalate even. And to the east there was Wallachia, Moldavia, right? The Hungarians essentially did extend towards the east in some measures, even up to Russia and the Russian principalities, and having therefore a huge, think about geographically speaking what this means, longitudinally speaking, it's a long way, right, from west to east, and Wallachia and Moldavia had accepted fundamentally Hungarian suzerainty in a way or another, albeit this was relatively short-lived. And as a result, these black Romanian principalities even fit into other essentially military cultures in part, right? Albeit there was obviously an influence in this regard. So, as we have recalled before, the Hungarians or Magyars were these nomadic people, basically of Finno-Ugrian origin, right, which is a separated branch, for example, from the Turkic one, but it also had included, in fact, large numbers of Khazars and other Turkic populations during the migrations. And you know the story, essentially, of Hungary and its formation after an era of intense warfare in which the Magyars had raided across much of Central Europe, and the Germans tried essentially to even destroy the nascent Magyar state. The Magyars suffered a major military defeat, famously at Lechfeld in 955. That is what effectively brought them to settle, definitely speaking. Actually, Lechfeld is a bit magnified by Ottonian propaganda. The Battle of Riad in 933, and also the clashes with the Bavarians, the Bavarian branch of the Ottonians that are kind of, overlooked because they were overshadowed, in fact, by Ottonian propaganda, did contribute to wear out this strength that had characterized these peoples, had settled in the Pannonian Basin since centuries, right? And that did contribute to alter even ethnic. I mean, think about the same fact that Hungary speaks an Ugro-Finnic language, right? Whereas, for example, Bulgaria doesn't. Bulgaria is a Slavic country, albeit being dominated initially by this component coming from the steppes as well. And the creation of the Hungarian, so that gives you even the impact that of course certain groups had in the domination, in the cultural domination of certain areas. These were essentially Slavic, or at least Slavicized areas after the decline of for example, the Avar Khaganate to the in fact the establishment of the Hungarian. Of the settlement of the Hungarians, these areas had seen the rise, for example, of Great Moravia, right? They had been Slavicized, and the Slavic element, as we will see today, actually remained pretty strongly in many areas, but politically speaking, Hungary did essentially split in two, what we call, in fact, the Western Slavs, essentially, and the Yugoslavs, the Southern Slavs. This was a major event, historically speaking, that affirmed the presence of this very large domination in this central area of Europe that had an amazing story. Hungary being actually a very powerful entity that eventually crumbled under the pressure of the Ottomans, but remaining effectively a valid bulwark for a long time, and a power to be reckoned with, and with very peculiar ethnic characteristics. So the Battle of Lechfeld, however, is this turning point, approximately speaking, when part of, first of all, the Magyar military aristocracy, and I want to stress the military character because these were steppes peoples that, had now settled down, so things had already changed, but they had maintained this strong model of leadership and of military organization on the steppes based on this raiding strategy, essentially. And great part of this nobility was slaughtered in the battle, right? And the Magyars suffered at this point this major psychological blow as well that essentially made them revolving, albeit being always a bit more suspensed, geographically speaking, across several areas, to revolve around the German Empire, right? And this was a turning point exactly also for this reason, because as for other countries, it was not for granted at that point in history that certain peoples would actually fit into the Western sphere, right? Think about all the religious competition, etc. Well, the Magyars did convert to Roman Catholicism, so they stuck to the West. The German, Frankish models, let's say, poured, as we will see now, from Germany, from Italy, consistently into Hungary, basically throughout all of its history. In fact, Hungary, like Poland, like Bohemia, would be progressively and increasingly westernized over time, right? And this naturally brought also in Magyar warfare a consistent amount of foreign elements, literally meant, like, not just influences, but literally people coming from literally all of Western Europe, as we will see now, that were quite important, even to restructure, actually, the Hungarian military from the tribal Ugriphinic background into this essentially Western and Frankish feudal model that was affirming itself all over Europe, all over Western Europe at this time. It would invest actually the same parts of the Balkans, for example, and there would be a lot to say, but we can't now. We're making a synthesis about the military background, right? So at this point, Hungary became officially Christian in 1001, right? Famously with the rise of its first king, right? It's the central direction, Stefan of the Arpad dynasty, famously speaking, would rule effectively up to the time of the Angevins, and these great ethnic dynasties, like, I don't know, the Piasts in Poland and the Przemyślids in Bohemia, that will manage to give unity to this otherwise tribal and relatively, I mean, maybe cohesive, but not really still consolidated, solidified ethnic groups, right, from a political point of view. And Western European feudal institutions were introduced now among the elites that began to adopt Western military systems and styles, right? And Hungary essentially remained on the defensive up to, from the 10th century on the western frontier, right? Where actually war very often, especially with even this triangle between roughly Bohemia, Austria, and in fact Hungary, that was a pretty tormented area and probably didn't even develop a big deal because of this essentially nature of militarized frontiers in part, where Hungary was actually the largest power, right, and so also launched deep offensives, etc. But never actually threatening an expansion towards the west as such. Also because on the other frontiers they had other problems, right? And Hungary, in fact, started to press rather against its northern, southern, and eastern neighbors, right? And following the Magyar first occupation of central Danubian plain, their boundaries had rested on the crests of the Carpathians to the north, east and southeast. There is some doubt of the effectiveness of Magyar control over eastern Transylvania, as we quoted it before, but this was probably inhabited by semi-nomadic black tribes, so even the actual control of these peoples, for economically speaking, couldn't be more than a formal recognition by the foe, right? As such, it wasn't much of a structured local infrastructure to seize, etc. To the south, the Danube and Save rivers, there were these the set of essentially Croatian, Serbian, Bulgarian, and Byzantine territories, and from the mid-10th century, the western frontier incorporated Slovakia, but not Moravia, that had fallen into the orbit of Bohemia essentially. And the Magyar domination would essentially ran slightly west of today's Hungarian-Austrian frontier, right? Along which it remained essentially unchanged during this period. By the mid-13th century, interestingly enough, Croatia and Dalmatia had essentially been absorbed by Hungarian domination, a bit through warfare, through marriage alliance, etc. And Bosnia was also conquered from the Serbs, and Western Wallachia fell under Hungarian suzerainty as well. That's when the massive blow of the Mongols in 1241 arrived. Right, the country was ravaged, but it didn't fall under Mongol domination as other areas of Eastern Europe actually would, bordering the same Hungary. And there is this great capability of recovery of the Hungarian kingdom that during the 14th century, as we have recalled, developed into this centralized state model on the given by the Angevin line, etc. But the thing was already structurally a might in itself. So, you know, today we stop here, but just for saying that was in the 14th century was a phase of expansion that began, especially with a temporary retaking of Bosnia in the 20s and the extension of Hungarian power over Wallachia and Moldavia until the 60s of the 14th century. So what we talk about today is largely the history of the transition from the traditional major military style to the westernized models, we can say. So traditionally, the typical major army would consist of this small tribal elite of cavalry that consisted essentially the bulk of the army, like all the peoples of the steppes, and then this very large numbers of essentially lightly equipped horse archers that were largely unarmored, although, you know, things could vary. Really, there was also in this. I mean, they could use essentially every weapon and every armor depending on the availability, but that this was also the political and social segmentation. After all, these powerful clan leaders that embodied the elite, and then all these clienteles that depended on them, right? And what is fascinating in this sense is you have a major European power at this point that is Western conceptually. I mean, there is nothing essentially in the Hungarian kingdom that fits into you know, a non-European standard, but you find this massive influences and contacts still with areas that are very, very far away, as such, and that still retain this political and military styles that are definitely very, very fascinating and unique. Tactics were initially based on the Eurasian steppes tradition, right? And what is fascinating about it is that there was a consistent closeness rather to the western rather than eastern steppes in Hungarian, in Hungary, if you would prefer at that point, military style. And in fact, it seems that Hungarian warfare in the beginnings was much closer to, let's say, to Iran, ideally to the Middle East proper, than to the Central Asian Turkish areas. For example, Magyar bows were somewhat closer to the ones you found in Sassanid Persia, Caucasus, or even in the Byzantine or early Islamic powers than into the Turkish side that had, by this point in history, taken over large parts essentially of the Western and the Near East and become dominant. The closeness to Middle Eastern military tradition is also revealed by, for example, the use that Magyars did of siege engines, which is something that actually this is rare among steppes peoples as such, and in fact they weren't. Not even the Avars actually displayed this ultra-typically completely nomadic character. Those knew how to use engines pretty well at the same time, and this is explainable in many ways that today we don't stop on because we talk essentially about cavalry, but just for saying how this contacts with the Islamic world specifically were typical of 10th and 11th century Hungary, and this would actually survive. We will see today even up to the 13th century in many ways. just consider all the commercial circuits here. That think about this, where these guys came from, and the proximity to this greater Varangian, Khazar, and Persian commercial routes and systems, and what all the military technologies gravitated, especially in the early period, like between thinking the 10th to the 11th century, in this area. In fact, we will see that there are even Scandinavian influences in Hungarian weaponry, even pretty later on, right? That could be a reminiscence of this influence that came from those times, so these shared technologies. So the massive phase of westernization, as we've seen, began from substantially the 10th century, and especially in the 12th, right, when it essentially came to its fulfillment in many ways. And as it often happens in these peoples that enter in contact with Frankish military models, you see that it's substantially the elite that adopts most of this ways, right? Chiefly the Hungarian royal household in this case, definitely mercenary troops that were Westerners by themselves, and also the leading barons. So essentially this aristocracy that in these kingdoms was always the big problem, right? These nobility that felt this political prerogatives based on the ethnic pride, this greater egalitarian ideal that came from the tribal tradition, for which the king is just one above, like a primus inter pares, not a person above the others as such, in that effectively the power of the people was shared by all the group and not by just one leader, right? Were a major problem for the process of centralization. So the reason why it was effectively the monarchy that mostly invested into foreign military models is explained like in basically any other context. You can find it literally everywhere at this point. And the fact that these foreigners once settled in Hungary in this case, but at that point depend substantially on the royal support and would be detached essentially from the rest of the aristocracy, at least for a few generations, after which they actually would essentially mix with the rest. So for this reason, there was also this continuity, especially in this kind of central Eastern monarchies, in this continuous settlement, even of peoples coming from the steppes, that were essentially knocking at the door, and there could be an agreement at that point that could, that the king could definitely sign, because of its authority, and that would be aimed at essentially countering through the royal and foreign alliance the local ethnic aristocracy that at this point was becoming, for this very political reason, essentially xenophobic, because they were saying, we are the true ones. By the way, these peoples were dramatically mixed, as we've seen since the beginning. I mean, so it's kind of, but you have to contextualize these political orientations, naturally, what it meant effectively at the time, and effectively shared power, etc. Then, let's say that the properly major bulk of the kingdom was effectively in charge of military power, right? These elites represented the finest military element of the conquerors that had, seized with and ruled with iron fist these areas because of right of conquest. That's the idea, right? But definitely the situation was much more composite, in a more real frame, and there were especially many areas of the Hungarian, let's say, the major dominated kingdom that were especially of different ethnic background, and chiefly Slavs, right? And that had always been agricultural, traditionally, like sanitary people at this point, and kind of fully sedentarized from the migration era, that had always had different customs from these other nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples, right? And that yet had substantially even improved and stabilized even mutuating, political models, and even essentially negotiating the local political autonomy, right? So imagine the Pannonian Plain, which is the perfect area of settlement of the nomadic people, and then all around these hillier areas, all the Slavic settlements that would remain, as we will see, aside from some undeniable major influence, however largely traditional, fighting in their own way and essentially influencing the military of the ruling class, of the Magyars themselves. So naturally in the 13th century this process has already increased pretty fast. Now we'll see why, but just think, however, of the progressive sedentarization, what this entails, even in how you effectively run an army, and how even you simply mix with the local population. So in this sense, Hungary is it's not properly a Slavic country, but it's obvious that the majority of the Slavs were many, right? They contributed eventually to structuring the same Hungarian kingdom in the way it was being organized and ruled, etc., participating to the military, etc. Consider that the Slavs are, kind of stereotypically even pictured in this migration era period, which the eastern you go, and the longer it becomes, like compared to Western Europe, they've always been stereotypically pictured like essentially as the foot troops following the one of as a subordinated community following the rulers of the steppes that brought them alongside them and making them kind of the dirty job that the mounted elite didn't want to do, especially in siege warfare and so on. And this is a bit the picture, but naturally even the Slavs had gotten shaped and structured in their political military structures heavily by these equestrian peoples, right? If you look at the percentage of mounted troops in early Polish armies, let's say between the 10th and the 11th century, that is pretty damn impressive. We're talking about even a ratio of 1-to-3, or 1-to-2, or something like that. That is really big for a people that is namely essentially a sedentary one, right? So actually think about the wave that this various invasions, think about the Huns, the Avars, the Bulgars, the Hungars bring in this area, and how and the Mongols even afterwards. So all military influences that really contribute even to strengthen the political military capabilities of the locals to cope, right, with this. Naturally, it was a lot of cooptation even from the same ruling class of the Magyars and the local tribes and this other peoples, and this went alongside, as we have seen before, with the process of military so-called westernization. Right, and this was actually more apparent in Hungary among this within the Slavic areas, right, than in the Pannonian Basin proper. And because here arms and armor essentially, as well as military tradition more broadly, had actually never ceased to be within the wider European traditions. Like the Slavs had definitely had their share of kind of nomadic influence, but they had remained fundamentally a sedentary people, right? This new conquerors even had their ethnic pride and identity concentrated on the same equestrian model, right? This is something that even later Slavic powers at one point, especially the ethnic aristocracy, would retake. Like think about the Polish Szlachta. I mean, thinking about descent from the Sarmatians, right? Maybe probably was in part too, ethnically speaking, but the concept was like more sticking to the model of the steppe, and there is a reason for that, because the model of the steppe rules with a much tougher iron fist than the egalitarian tradition. So it's obvious that when these peoples structure kind of more consistent dominations, they have to legitimize and to enforce this idea that must be a king, there must be a ruler, there must be someone who bears arms and controls, right? And these steppes models were perfect in that regard. And by the 12th century, Hungary was making use of Balkan troops as well, drawn from areas that had been under Western European influence since Carolingian times. And despite a considerable major impact, the military traditions, for example, of areas like the northern Carpathian Mountains, also remained essentially Western, right? And were undergoing, in fact, themselves a further Westernization, also through colonization of these areas from, by, for example, German communities, right? And the same process is to be seen going on during the 13th and 14th centuries, right? There are the moments in which effectively these monarchies, including Hungary, actually take more clearly and at this point substantially indistinguishable Western fascias, especially from a political institutional point of view. About military speaking, you can find still certain kind of allogen elements that are progressively integrated and eventually diluted over time, but still, being next door also as a source of recruitment. By the 13th century that we're discussing today, in 14th, you can see that the traditional or steppe elements had been essentially revived or reinforced through these migrations of large numbers of Kuman, Kipchak refugees, right, into Hungary, especially at the time of the Mongol invasions, but not only. This is to be found actually very early, since the 11th century, first with the Pechenegs, actually, eventually with the Kumans that were kind of more consistently, more numerically consistent, let's say. But alongside this, what you see here, that the dominant now feudal nobility was sedentarized, right? So the Hungarian knights, the heavily armored ones we're looking at today, were substantially indistinguishable from their German and Italian counterparts, right? They were, of course, some German settlers themselves, German Teutonic knights, even in such areas as Transylvania, but essentially you find actually big numbers even of French, Italian, even English and Spanish knights that are settled in Hungary at this time, right? All for creating essentially this bulk of loyal troops that to the sovereign, that alongside with them bring all of this military cultures, traditions, and gears and styles that in fact all recur in archaeology and iconography, as we will see. But it's not just because of them. It's like literally certain areas of Hungary, and especially the Slavic ones, were essentially letting these influences in, right? And even certain external Slavic powers, like Bohemia, for example, that at this point had a prosper iron making production, was at that point, I don't know, essentially indistinguishable from German military armaments in terms of, and therefore all this influence is to be seen. Yet this experience of Hungary with against nomads from the steppes, were just across the Carpathian Mountains, made the Hungarian army using a lot of pretty substantial quantities of substantially lightly armed horse archers of various origins, right? These populations migrating from the steppes were literally ultra mixed, and it's, at one point it doesn't even make sense to try to distinguish them ethnically speaking. But in this, there is a kind of a Pontic character that the Hungarian military shares, in part even with the same Byzantine Empire, especially during the 13th century. Westernization was observable even through other equipment, for example, the crossbow, that is particularly spread in Slovakia, in the Slavic areas of the north of the kingdom, and the crossbow at this point spread essentially throughout all Hungary, and albeit still by the 15th century basically had not been completely ousted. Had not completely ousted the composite handbow that was traditional of the Hungarian war. In fact, the most distinctive Hungarian ethnical military traditions were the ones related to the bow, right? And I say this before talking about Hungarian knights because this makes you understand that in a world like this, like you can have something that is dominantly Western in aspect and in practices, etc. But these knights were coming from very diverse military backgrounds, or at least there were many military traditions that were influencing them that also definitely had used them to fight in certain ways. I mean, we have seen how large Hungary was, and think about what this means in terms of who you're used to fight all over this enormous perimeter of the kingdom, in terms of diversity of enemies, right? We're stretching here from the Italians to the Russians, from the Poles to the Byzantines. So we're talking about lots of different peoples that of course have their share of influence on the consolidating Hungarian kingdom, and at this point is a pretty massive thing, as we recalled. The Hungarians originally had tactics that are associated with the peoples of Western steppes, right? These include, for example, wagons drawn up to form field fortifications, which is typical of those peoples, and these are traditions that actually you can find pretty easily in armies like the Polish, the Bohemian ones, and maybe it's even exaggerated to say that it's a strictly steppes influence, but still it's important because it's famously in kind of these areas, so probably was some influence that, however, every army that we know, had this amount of wagons, and that they used them in a kind of military situations, depending. But the idea is that the larger the armies are, and especially the larger the territory that you have to cover is, right? This is particularly, we made several videos, for example, in Polish warfare, especially at the time, in the early modern times, when the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was huge, territorially speaking. It's not just that on the eastern frontiers they had, and even within their own army, lots of steppes troops to cope with, but that they literally had to shift armies for like thousands of kilometers at a time, maybe back and forth. So that did influence even the disposability of this means. And there are some kind of maybe there is a prejudice that I'm not sure how spread is today, but it has to do with the idea that Hungarian armies are somewhat considered a bit oriental looking for the later influence that the Ottomans would have on them. Well, this is probably not accurate because, first of all, up to this point there was no Ottomans. Like, the Ottomans emerged essentially in the late 13th century, and anyway, it's much more likely that the Hungarian army had its own traditional influences from the rest of its context, even with the Islamic world, with a certain Pontic dimension, right? They were very, very strong. Consider that Hungary here controls basically all the Danubian route. The Danubian route arrived straight in Black Sea, towards the Caspian Sea, and these areas that were not actually very far from which the Magyars also had come from, originally speaking. So, as far as we can understand. And that controlled enormous trade flows with the East, like the Silk Road ended essentially in, with the arrived at the Danube, right? So that was an area through which also a lot of military technology did pass, and in fact it seems that it was also the same Hungarians, as we will see in a while, that brought, even in Western Europe, certain influences that would become distinctive. I mean, they're fair details, telling the truth, but that distinctive of, for example, Western armor, or at least developing them earlier, just before the Westerner, the Frankish warfare would develop them in itself. That could as well be that these people, being more exposed to the Eastern world, had easier and early access to than others, right? So, aside from this, let's think of what could be like, stereotypical 13th century Hungarian knight First of all, let's think about a datum that is very important we haven't addressed yet, is that the conversion of the Magyars by the Catholic rather than the Greek Orthodox Church, right? This brought, as we've seen, together with the entering essentially in German political sphere rather than the Byzantine one, the presence of the Hungarian court of German mercenaries, German knights proper, from an early date, right? And this brought a German influence which prevailed in military matters. In fact, the senior nobility of Hungary, associated with the king's court, had already adopted German arms and armor by essentially the 10th, the 11th century, right? So very, very early. And they called them, the Hungarians called these guys like the Saxon mercenaries, even if they came from literally all over Western Europe, as we have seen. And this had a massive influence, actually, especially in the equipment of the royal household, right? Whereas elsewhere in the country, native forms of armor, such as, for example, which were prevalent perhaps up to the mid-12th century. The 12th century is really the key of the moment in which, there is this transition towards a definitive Western model, right? That's the reason why we don't speak actually what was the traditional Hungarian knight in the 13th century as such, because that tradition had fundamentally been absorbed. Like, it could be found by analogy among other populations that had somewhat remained more transhumant, maybe at the outskirts in certain communities of the kingdom, of other peoples that maybe were even associated ethnically in origin to the Magyars that poured in the kingdom of Hungary at one point. But by this point, the core of the Hungarian heavily armored knights was essentially identical by the 13th century, because of the changes of the last 2 or 3 generations of the one of Western Europe. And this was a relatively fast process, right, that went in parallel probably with consolidation of the Hungarian kingdom proper, as by the mid-12th century, Otto of Freising tells us that the rural Hungarian knights, so the guys that had substantially remained out of these major centers around which the crown was structuring its territorial domination in a sanitary model, and fully Christian and Catholic, ecclesiastical administration, for example, hierarchy, etc., were just beginning to adopt the arms and tactics of the Germany mercenary companies. Now, this is very interesting because, by the way, by the 12th century, German military companies are kind of spreading around. You find a lot of Germans fighting in Poland, in Bohemia, and in Hungary as well, as mercenaries. And in all of these countries, you find that the kings are terribly fond of these guys because they know they can help them to keep the local aristocracy at bay. So Otto Freising's witness is very interesting because it shows you that there was a kind of an opposition between this core, probably actually overlapping with the royal household, and this kind of rural aristocracy, who was kind of still more traditionalist and tendentially adverse to central rule, that retained as a consequence even certain styles, right? We don't have to think that those guys didn't actually know how to fight the German way, the Western way, because in fact the same sources says that at this time we're beginning to get used to that, right? But at the same time, it could be even just a style, really, even certain features, certain clothing, certain types of styles that we're saying, look, I'm not of this party, of the pro kind of foreign one, right? I'm just for the traditionalist and strictly Magyar thing that we were at the beginning, right? There is also, however, the Byzantine influence that we have that generally is disregarded because, the Western influence is stronger, and eventually the same Byzantine Empire is crushed in the Fourth Crusade at the beginning of the 13th century. So it's not actually a long... during the 12th century, telling the truth, the Byzantine Empire had re-expanded exactly along the Danubian frontier. And against the Hungarians, it had actually become a major threat to the empire proper, right? First of all, as we will see now, we have lots of sources of Byzantine chroniclers actually describing Hungarian knights. But at the same time, we have to realize that as every war essentially makes an hybrid of the military culture of the contenders, that there were definitely Byzantine influences in the in Hungarian warfare and style, etc. That, however, are kind of a bit more difficult to observe, and they weren't the only ones, as we have seen. And we'll talk about the ones of the steppes specifically later, right? Because even these troops that coming from the steppes were settled down in Hungary, like, they usually didn't have much of a heavy bulk, right? Because in the steppes it's like that. You have an enormous amount of lightly armored troops and just a very tiny armored elite. And you can actually say that even in Hungary, probably this time the ratio had evolved in that regard. I mean, the fact that of westernization had brought paradoxically to a higher amount of armored troops in traditional major warfare, right? It was more elitary and kind of more en masse. Now all those Norman horse archers had settled down, had become farmers largely, right? Maybe also having livestock and cattle in certain areas. We do know they remained transhumant, especially around the Carpathian areas that had those traditions even since before, right? But those were, I mean, the fact that these were lighter troops doesn't mean that they didn't impact even the same heavily armored knights, cavalrymen, with gear coming from the steppes, and we'll see, in fact, it's actually the case. However, going back to the Byzantines, for example, there is the chronicle Constantine Manasses, writing essentially in the first half of the 12th century, that describes the Hungarian knights as all having helmets, heavy armor, spears, and corselets, right? So this is the typical equipment of a Western knight at the time. Like, so the traditional military style was kind of lighter, right, is at this point surpassed, right? Not that the Magyars didn't have their elite, their armored elite. Actually, they had it. It was pretty damn tough and even ultra armored, right? The point here of the chronicle is that kind of says that all Hungarian knights, so it stresses, I mean, knights meant probably not as all the cavalrymen, right, but knights specifically, having all these helmets, every armor, spears, and course. So there was a sort of uniformation, if you want, in this broader model that entailed, by the way, a relation with the land, evidently. These guys were landed aristocracy that had lots of property they could draw resources from and and train on for and essentially adopting the same lifestyle that the feudal knights in Western Europe had. There's another beautiful chronicle, the one from Niketas Koniates, one of the greatest Byzantine authors of the time, of the late 12th, beginning of the 13th century. When in his account of the Battle of Semlin in 1176 records even heavier equipment. This is particularly important because he says, quote, "Not only were the warriors covered by corselets to the teeth, but their horses also had straps and plates of armor on their foreheads and breasts to protect them." Now, this is a very, very interesting notation. I remember ever since when I studied some years ago Niketas Koniates chronicle, and this is very interesting because actually we don't have evidence, as you know, of essentially metal armor for European knights before essentially the 13th century, right? So this moment in which, of course, we knew that metal armor was used, but we don't have the actual evidence for it, and it's obvious that actually metal plates for were always used. Like, we can find it since ancient times, so it's conceptually not anything new. But to a medieval military historian, the idea is that, before the 13th century, plate armor doesn't appear, right, in Europe. It's something that starts developing in 13th century, especially starting from Germany, seemingly. And I even made a video about that, the origin of Western coat of plates in the West, Germany in 13th century. And there were lots of interesting suggestions of how, like, first of all, as you know, the coat of plate would eventually spread homogeneously all over Europe. So Germany in itself is not much of like the inventor, but the question should be, why did it appear there, right, before than others, and especially on the eastern German frontier, that was incidentally the one, in fact, with Poland, with essentially with Hungary as well, right? And Niketas Konianis is writing exactly from this, is a contemporary here in the second half of 12th century and beyond. So we're talking about a source that was actually, now we don't know whether it was invented, could have used a classical model, etc. But state, because Byzantine chronicles are quite stylized in many ways, so they write things we don't know how. It's just a literary source, right? But it tells us that Hungarian knights already had kind of plate armor, typically in fact covering where plate armor starts to appear normally for horses, like the chest and front and the forehead, right? So it's obvious, cavalry charges frontal, so you get to protect the breast and the head. It's fine, perfectly plausible. And the problem is that we don't have a terrific amount about the rest of European cavalry to say, okay, we know how it happened, right? So finding since the origins, we know it was there. That even coat of mail for horses starts being spread during the 13th, etc. Century, etc. But this early reference to actual coat of plates is very fascinating. It's unique in its kind. And how could it be explained? Well, there is an explanation that, in this sense, is connected also to the development of coat of plates, even in what so-called Western Europe, from the one we noticed from Germany, that actually starts from the and this is, by the way, this is plate armor for horses, right? So in Germany it appears from this plate armor. This is essentially around your belly, right? And completely around, even up to your back. So this is being suggested that it happened during the 13th century because of this increase of warfare on the, say, eastern frontiers with the Mongols, right? There is all the story even of the Polish belt armor that was probably an organic thing. We find iconographically, and I still have to give an answer to a person who asked me the sources for that. I'm finding them. And that tells us that quite likely in this kind of eastern sector, eastern direction, let's say better, of Europe, were coming kind of better protections that could be highlighted, especially in the Slavic world, and maybe even among the Lithuanians, etc., associated to even certain types of shields that were probably more functional against against missile fire, essentially, that could have spread, in fact, the use of plate armor. That probably plate armor could be even in organic material, right? So that's also why we don't know a deal much. Because probably there was this stuff around, and even in the West, we usually associate the massive development of plate armor over time because of the development of crossbow warfare that was equally important. We can't exclude the fact that, I don't know, maybe even in Hungary, among these Hungarian knights that Niketas Konianis is talking about, maybe, they had developed it not much because they were on the eastern frontier. They feared arrows from some kind of steppe people on the eastern borders, maybe because crossbow fire was developing. And we don't really know, because actually we know fairly well that that plate armor, even parts of plate, but even the same coat of mail, is fairly rare, even in the West. Like in the West, if you have metal armor for a horse, you're like the ultra hyper mega super elite you can find, right? Already having plate armor for a knight, you had to be enormously rich for having that. And even in the 15th century, there's the greatest spread of plate armor in historically in warfare horses were largely unarmored, right? Or at least they had some type of gambesson, just like knights had, by the way, that is not dramatically recorded either iconographically speaking. So we don't know excessively much about this, but gambesson was solidly widespread, right? Much more than we think. Actually, it was pretty damn effective, because contrarily-wise to popular opinion, gambesson can stop an astonishing amount of blows, including cuts from swords, etc. At least it depends also how the blades are sharpened, whatever. But it's important now that we have this evidence, this further evidence of a greater disposition for protection in the Eastern world, probably due to missile fire, wherever it came from, let's say, and that is significant. And it's significant in this case, especially because it's a Byzantine source that states it. It's not that, Hungary is dramatically documented in this. Now, in fact, even if you look at it seems not even there is an enormous interest for modern Hungarian 13th century warfare, because I didn't find an enormous amount, not even of picture, right? If you go on Pinterest, etc., you search for pictures to, you type Hungarian knight, it's plenty of stuff from about the 14th to 15th century. Go for the 13th century, is basically nothing, right? So there is not even this enormous interest, because probably there is not even a dramatic amount of evidence. Right, I've checked here some arms and armor books and stuff, and yeah, there are actually lots of archaeological and iconographical finds, as we will find out now in the video. But there is not a kind of a iconic representative picture like you could have in this time in, in England, in France, in Italy. That is where plenty of stuff about. So Hungary remains also this dimension that has its own, still it fits into this category of countries that live east of the core of the solidly Francicized culture, or you can have in Germany or Italy at this point, and that borders with them, and that in fact influences them, as we've seen, and that rely on a kind of a more ethnic and tribal, but also politically and socially are not so, for example, so productive in terms of sources, right? I had the luck of studying some Hungarian sources of the 13th century, late 13th century, for the battle, for a war is started, and you realize they're completely like in another place compared, to German sources in that case. They all revolve about the ethnical stuff. It's a completely kind of a royal perspective. I mean, you realize that there's not that flourishing middle class. It's a different world. It's something else. It's like much wilder, if you want. And this does reflect the society that still existed there, was so varied, as we will see. These were, on average, kind of not dramatically urbanized or developed areas. I mean, they had their own. The tribal element remained more, even in terms of military practice, as a matter of fact. And the typical Hungarian knight of the 13th century, what could it be? Like, we have some church fresco that shows the dates from the 13th century that effectively depicts Hungarian armor as identical, literally identical to that in use elsewhere in Europe at the time. We're talking about the mail hauberk, the shoes, that are these armor for the legs, usually made of mail, that were basically the standard type of metal leg armor in Europe roughly from the 11th to the 14th century. From the 11th, maybe not in Hungary specifically, but at this time, definitely yes. They could extend to the knee or over the entire leg, like in this case. And they offered flexible protection. I mean, it's like you have like stockings, essentially, that in mail. And they were pretty effective against, especially slashing weapons. This is the big deal of what even the mail is about. It's designed primarily to stop slashing weapons, because the major deal is cutting wounds that can infect and then you die, rather, because otherwise it's dramatically it's not that easy, in fact, to kill someone otherwise, if it's covered in mail, right? However, they still felt the full force of crushing blows and also piercing, so blunt traumas, weaponry, shock, and also piercing, right? Although the gambeson underneath was usually pretty effective also at absorbing that. You have these accounts of medieval knights of the time, like pierced by kind of a, like a hedgehog, full of arrows, like, but they didn't hit at least consistently under the protection. And shows with polanes attached, plate polanes, right? And the polane, or genouillère in French, that dominated the military vocabulary at the time, was this armor that protected the knee, right? And that simple as that. Worked for elbows too, but not dramatic. The legs were more exposed, especially the ones of knights, of course, from even infantry is developing. Like Hungary, I don't think it had an enormous deal of. Probably, especially was around the most intensely Slavic areas that were kind of more dangerous infantries. We know from Croatia, for example, but definitely Hungary was not a place where there was a terrific advancement of infantry. But still, just a mob of peasants. Every knight knew how dangerous that could turn, and definitely, if you're on horseback, you're an easy target anyway, and the legs at least are the ones that are immediately attacked by boys on foot, and you need better protection there. Not only, and then of course, like every knight of the time, would be a surcoat, like with colors depicted in symbols and the various emblems, etc. Arms comprised dagger, sword, and lance, right? So it's daggers, as you know, developed in the 13th century mostly as this knight versus knight weapon, with the improvements of armor at the time and the spread of plate armor. Sometimes the only way to actually kill someone was to stick this daggers into like armpits or eye slits, etc. In a very physical kind of wrestling like fight that of course would occur mostly when the formations had been exhausted, and the guys would literally, that had the spears broken, their swords broken for that matter at some point. They would literally grab each other and try to stamp each other that way. And it's interesting that of course the dagger could be used also in other ways, but it's important it was there. There was also this is a bit folkloristic, is the Hungarian beard, because in the earlier parts, like in the 11th, 12th century, most Hungarian wore beards, right? But by the late 13th century, it seems that many Hungarians adopted, among the aristocracy as well, the Kuman custom of shaving the chin, including even King Ladislas IV himself, right, who was actually half Kuman himself, and who was condemned by a papal legate for adopting Turkish weapons and shaving his beard, right? So at this point, Ladislas had basically an army of Kumans, right? He disdained the local ethnic aristocracy because he rightfully thought they were unreliable towards the king. And the way he went on with this armies, literally of Kumans, like in a few, of course, local aristocrats. That's how he would participate to the Battle of Markfeld in that regard. And therefore, shaving the chin at that point was a political shout-out. It's saying, look, I do the Kuman way, right? Which means that I don't stick with the local traditions, because those who pursue them here are essentially against the monarchic institution, or at least towards my the attempt of centralization, etc. Another character that is very interesting is that Hungarians, mostly at this time, would retain, and at least some of them, still the short stirrups that are this proof, evidently, of a lasting Asiatic influence, right? The short stirrup is... Long stirrups are essentially for the charge, shock charge. That the idea that you have to stretch all your legs to point yourself well before the impact, because essentially when you're going to crash against the enemy, what you have to absorb the hit from the horse are your legs through the stirrups and in the saddle, and you have to have hell of legs muscles, like all people who go on horseback actually know they must have. And this shorter stirrup means, on average, not meaning that now all Hungarians vote, like, absolutely not. Of course, they would use even the long stirrup. But it's still the idea that there was this kind of equestrian tradition that contemplated the much more dynamic fight on horseback with much faster movements. They're typical, actually, of a slightly lighter form of horsemanship, and that are associated with certain types of tactics. So the stereotype in here, just for these peoples that got kind of Frankicized over time, is that the ultra heavily armored knight is proper of the Western direction, right? And these others would retain kind of more traditional fighting styles that they didn't know feudalism at the beginning, so they didn't have so heavily armored troops, and that therefore didn't even need to have this dramatically long stirrups to fight in certain ways, and were on average lighter. But once again, it's an approximation, and you don't have to think it was kind of every one of them did. So this is the idea, and I would pass to a set of informations about actual archaeological and iconographical evidence that I decided to split into 3 parts that are essentially, we'll see now in order, the strictly kind of major Hungarian, whatever you want to call it, military tradition, right? Then the properly Slavic one, so those Slavic characters that were actually carrying Germanic, Frankish military traditions within them at this point, and also the Cuman one, the Cuman influence that was definitely very important, not just in light cavalry, but also in these heavily armored horsemen that evidently were closer to that mindset than we often think, that mindset of the steppe. So we can give a look, for example. I didn't find all of this stuff, actually, not even a great amount of this, but they are recorded in some books, so I thought to list them without the picture anyway, because I couldn't get it. So let's start from spearheads. Like, this stuff could be from both for cavalry and infantry, actually, from the 11th to 13th century. First of all, we don't know how to date exactly every single weapon in here. Actually, we give a time span of, in absence of certain specific details. They could be from 2 centuries distance. We don't really know, but tendentially towards the 13th we have here probably what could be interpreted as an evolution, right, which is the gradual westernization of Hungarian weapons. There were in these spears that are preserved at the National Museum of Budapest in Hungary, can be associated with the Eurasian steppe style of even the early migration period, right? The others are kind of Western European in form, and others display instead a lot of features in common with weapons from Eastern Europe and the Baltic states. It's very interesting. I mean, this northern connection with areas that are not directly bordering, like Russia maybe in this regard, but let's say that this influence from a northeastern world there that maybe was what anciently connected, even in part, the Magyars via trade routes, these peoples of the northeast is still here. And there is no particular reason to collocate these finds in a specific chronological order, but it's evident that there is a progressive transition from the early tribal model to the kind of Western one, passing through these other influences, but it's likely that we're in use all at the same time. Then we have some bronze mace heads that we found from Hungary, always at the National Museum of Budapest, dated to the 11th to the 13th centuries. And these are relatively small bronze mace heads that actually seem to have been popular in many parts of Eastern Europe, right, all wide. And such weapons are not the typical mace like you can imagine, the aristocratic weapon that was actually very spread among the steppes aristocracies there, but these are kind of small, right? They were even used by seemingly poorer warriors. This is very interesting because this could be even ordinary tribesmen among the Magyars of the Hungarian plains, or even peasant villagers in the Slav areas. In any case, wherever you find a mace, even if it's not a big deal, it's still telling you that there was some form of armor around, right? That is for smashing, right? And at that point, it's cheaper and easier or to have spear, right? Instead, if you have to have this trauma weapon, essentially, there is something that either closer combat, right, that entails a bit more of tribalism, if you want, but also more preferably this kind of a trauma, this blunt need, right? Talking about swords, roughly the same period, always. This is all in the National Museum of Budapest, so I don't repeat myself. But you can find that, as we've seen before, German and Slav influences actually spread across Hungary, right? And this is confirmed even through swords, right? These swords are generally straight, with relatively long crossguards and nut-shaped or oval pommels that fit in the Western European tradition. There is one weapon though that is basically single-edged, right, or has at least priority given to one edge specifically. And as you know, this is typically associated with sabers, or at least that kind of even this Kramas expedition. I mean, this idea of the one-edged weapon that survives even, I don't know, for example, in the Long Messer in Germany, even late Middle Ages, this idea that the eastern direction had maintained, in that case it's literally a knife. This is not a knife but a sword, right? But this might reflect the survival of a saber style, a sword, playing among Hungarian horsemen, right? That we know at the beginning was really there, right? Others see in it, which is in part the same thing, actually the evidence of a Scandinavian influence, because Scandinavian, especially Sweden, through that Russian and Khazar world, to which the early Magyars were actually close to, did retain, in fact, this kind of steppes influence that entailed single-edged weapons, right, that are seen in the far north in the 10th century, still Viking and Hungar invasions times, right? So these guys wandering around and actually probably meeting in different situations. But it's more likely the other way around, in fact, in the sense that the presence of such weapons in Scandinavia reflects Magyar or other Eastern European influences, or even, especially weapons that were brought back to Norway or Sweden by returning Vikings, right? Talking about arrowheads from the same period, roughly between the 11th and the 13th century, we see arrowheads in a varied collection that are tanked rather than socket type. And this reflects a Central Asian tradition that survived long in Magyar archery and equipment than basically in any other aspect of Hungarian military technology. And some of these blades are very broad and almost identical, in fact, to arrowheads that have been found in the Eurasian steppes. And there are particularly certain ones that are square or diamond-shaped in section, which, as we know, physically speaking, are the best designed to basically penetrate shield or armor, right? That's the section you must have to have a sounder impact on armor. This is very interesting because it tells you that there was definitely always a not just in this time, but also in early major warfare, this presence of ultra-elite and heavily armored troops, cavalrymen chiefly, that needed to be taken down some ways, or at least to to render their life more difficult. And we don't have to exclude actually that a 13th century Hungarian knight in part still perfectly knew how to use not just obviously to use a bow, but also that it could be used in battle. I don't have specific information about this. The 13th century is a better documented time. Is still somewhat late to maybe see this kind of hybrids, but you know that in steps, especially in this in the hottest part of the cauldron that they were, there was this ancient let's say hybrid between the lancer and the archer that eventually, tactically speaking, will split because it was not functional enough. But you know, the typical the cavalryman of the steppe could be essentially both things, and I wouldn't be surprised to see that maybe a 13th century Hungarian knight still used a bow in battle, aside from during the hunt, where that would have been more typical, but definitely not in a military context. Interestingly enough, we have also war axes, this time from I think excuse me, I don't know the name in Slav, but is I think Vratské Podradie in Slovakia. These war axes are from the 13th/14th century, and actually their location is unknown. These were documented by Rutkai. And these axes are very interesting because their blades are very narrow, and albeit this type was known elsewhere in Europe, it seems that it was particularly common in the Slavonic East, and it's been suggested that essentially, especially these types of axes were a late development of a long-lived traditional form. And that was probably conceived to be used on horseback, right? Is also particularly interesting, and to be found actually not just in the Hungarian tradition, but in probably Slavic ones that were evidently influenced by this nomadic warfare as well. Then there are certain spear or even pike heads that are originary of 13th, 14th century Hungary. This one, again, in the National Museum of Budapest. And these are different types of spearheads, probably infantry weapons, actually, but we're not completely sure. And two of them are fairly traditional. Another one may be actually an echo of the major steppes nomadic past, and or actually to have been introduced by the Cumans as well, which in that case probably wasn't necessarily so easily an infantry weapon. So it's possible that actually, you know, that in the 13th century warfare, there was a sort of race between cavalry and infantry spear length, essentially, and at a certain point, even the infantry weapons in certain areas, especially Western Europe, began even to be longer than the cavalry ones. But for saying that we don't really understand at that point, I mean, we don't have to think these were terribly sophisticated weapons. I mean, you know, the balance is always the same, the composition is substantially the same, and therefore these steppes influence is very interesting because it shows that certain spears, possibly to be used also on horseback, at this point were in fact maybe this was probably a Cuman using them, we don't know, but there wouldn't be anything particularly strange to maybe see even an ethnic Hungarian knight, let's say, using them on horseback as well as on foot, by the way. And don't think that knights didn't fight dismounted or not even in kind of more complex formations. It really depends, right? They were multitasked in every situation, preferably on horseback, but in certain conditions also dismounted. Then we keep finding bronze mace heads this time a bit of a lower time, between the 13th and 15th century. We don't know how to date them. This is instead from the Military Museum of Budapest, and as far as I know, there's no comprehensive study on these small maces. They're usually made of bronze, but not only, and as we have seen, used widely throughout Eastern Europe. And we don't know, in fact, even how to date them precisely, but they are really probably part of this horse-raising, semi-nomadic peoples still inhabiting, at this point, the Great Hungarian Plain. Chiefly also these nomads that were settled by the crown. And the interesting thing about this is, the mace also as a cavalry weapon, and not just to hit necessarily the heavily armored, but also concentrating in this mass of the mace head, a lot of force through galloping, running, etc. And that's to be considered in this military context. There are other arrowheads at this point from the National Museum of Budapest, a bit later from the previous ones we've seen from between the 13th and 14th century. And these seem to be of the tanked variety we have noticed before, which places them in the Eurasian steppe tradition. Yet, the majority of these swords also have narrow heads with sharply angled blades. None of them is of the leaf-shaped variety that was actually at that point very popular among the steppe nomads. And probably this means that we can see the persistency of horse archery techniques of the Magyar and Cuman warfare that, however, had been modified in the face of Western influence, and possibly also the spread of plate armor, especially at this point. If they are from the 14th century, especially, this had definitely increased in Hungary. And for this very reason, we find also between the 13th and 14th century the spread of crossbow, about which we find, in fact, bolts also to be found at the National Museum of Budapest, which have a diamond section, which is in order for puncturing armor, and bolt flights are of wood. And we think that they were used by the urban communities, either villages or cities proper, and not much by the semi-nomadic peoples of the plains. The reason is that we know in general crossbow spreads from this solidly kind of Frankish tradition. There is no mounted crossbowman in the steppe, right? At least not systemically, as far as I know. However, I must say that I'm studying for the early 14th century certain cases of actually areas that are close to the Hungarian kingdom, actually between today's Slovenia and parts of Kärnten, this essentially Germanic Slavic areas that at the point in the time were fairly close even to Hungary as such, and there were actually a lot of mounted crossbowmen as well. So it's as well possible that these people were essentially from the Banate of Croatia more than else, and in fact, hence the name has the word known elsewhere. And in fact, this seems to have been a typically either southern German or Slavic tradition in the area, and I'm sure that probably this had some sort of parallelism even in Hungarian warfare, where surely it was plenty of horse archers still, but maybe crossbowmen on horseback were also kind of widespread in a maybe if not in a comparable measure, at least in a systemic way. Because mounted crossbowmen are to be found all over Western Europe, telling you, there's nothing strange about it. Even horse archers, especially in the 14th century, during the 100 Years' War, for example, were fairly common. But it's the concept is, however, that the crossbow is mostly from, even at this point, of middle classes that at the period in Europe were fairly developed. So many think that it could come even from these Germanized settlements, right? German communities that effectively we know did use extensively crossbows at that point. So it's possible that they came from this specific areas of more sedentary peoples. The semi-nomadic cavalrymen of the plains would essentially rely on their traditional style, right? And the effectiveness of these weapons are substantially related to the tactics that you employ them with, right? Not much the fact, I have this technology and it works. No, basically never happens like that. And many people, actually it's easier to make fit the stereotype, the archer, the bow is superior, especially these ones that were kind of more Eastern influences as well, because of the, you know, the French against the English in the Hundred Years' War. But you know, sometimes it's also the other way around. It really depends, right? There is not an absolute thing that it's not a bow that makes the difference. Literally, not even in things like the Hundred Years' War, as it's there. In that case, at least the longbow being mostly famous for. It's really a matter of combined tactics. And if you had been a villager of these Slavic areas of the Carpathians, etc., you had been attacked by this, you know, swarms of horse archers from the steppe, you would have not been very happy about it, and you would have had trouble even with, you know, meeting them with crossbows, and vice versa, by the way. Then we have very interesting gold mounds of a sword belt dated to the 13th century in Hungary, still also in the National Museum of Budapest. And it's a magnificent sword belt, right? It's not just interesting as a piece of art, but also it provides from this, as far as I understand, fairly rare pictures of 13th century Hungarian warriors. I actually managed to find this among the pictures, so probably you're already seen it here. And it depicts them in this typically feudalized aristocratic fashion, right? So it's very clear, and it's interesting because there is no representation in here of the traditional, I mean, not even a hint of the semi-nomadic Magyar way of life at one time. And although it seems that some sections of Hungarian society apparently clung to these old ways still, as we have seen. However, this belt depicts 3 fully armored knights. They wear flat-topped great helms, right? Essentially in the German tradition. 2 with large crests, as it was normal at the time, also in other neighboring countries like Bohemia, for example. They have long-sleeved mail hauberks, probably with integral coifs, so this kind of headgear of mail around the head was worn over the gabs and underneath the helm itself. And there's also a 4th unhelmeted figure that shows it, so that's why we know that they wear it. It's interesting because it seems that the mittens are different in substance from the mail, which is kind of realistic, given that at this time there was extra protection being added to hands. They could be, however, also of padded or ladder construction, and therefore distinguished from the mittens proper. And this perhaps was this difference in the depiction was particularly researched by the artist to avoid visual confusion. In this regard, mail shoes are worn, and perhaps beneath padded or ladder cuisse, actually, for the thighs and knees, which was a real thing, because the cuisse, as we didn't say before, but they could even remain just in the lower part of the legs, right, not being covering the entire thigh, for example, or even just remaining to the knee length. And shields of these knights are relatively small, like it's actually normal for the 13th century. They're flat-topped, and kite-shaped, supported by guiche, so these straps. And two of the three swords are clearly tapering, while the third one, albeit pointed, has more parallel sides. The pommels may be round in part, while at least one seems to be diamond-shaped, while the horses have caparisons or bards. Right, this is interesting as well because it kind of recalls the protection that these horses could have, either organic or even something more, or at the time. And there are also a trumpeter and a drummer in the background, but the interesting part of this last detail, especially that, as from the peoples of the steppes, it was this emphasis on war drums, right, that are actually imminent in the Turco-Mongol and other armies from the steppes, right, and that really echo a bit of maybe in the picture that is otherwise very westernized, this kind of steppes character that was actually very deep, because there was all a deep religious and religious and military meaning alike towards. Like, it was the relation, this kind of etheric and celestial connection at a time between the horseman and the horse, and all these pagan ideals of the past were still surviving, right? And let's always remember in this regard that we're looking at something very refined here, that is probably expression, in fact, of the most updated, modern, and in this sense, in fact, westernized tradition. But the rest of the Hungarian nobility at this time must have retained an enormous deal of these mindsets and traditions and beliefs, much more than we actually think. Actually, even in Germany, there was much of this still view of the past, like thinking that, I mean, the Draco standards from the migration era are last to be found in 13th century Germany, right? So you can imagine what, how 13th century Hungary was still in this regard, having a much more, consistent tie with the steppe traditionally, and also continuated by these other injections, let's say, of nomadic peoples settled in Hungary. Then, interestingly enough, we have also some seals from same Hungarian kings. One from István Király, in fact, dated to 1270-72. That is actually the seal of the Hungarian prince that is shown as a typical European knight. And there is only one detail, though, that is amazing in this regard. This is the knotting of his horse's tail, right, which is the typical Turkish fashion, which in this sense sets the prince a little bit apart from Western tradition. And the idea is that the horse's tail could be even grabbed. Like, there was this idea in the nomadic world that, in fact, combat had to be very physical. It was extremely dynamic. I mean, the one on horseback. And therefore, sometimes it was even a matter of offense to pull the enemy's horse's tail, and therefore they knotted it. Right, this is to be, and this was done actually even as a ritual before battle. For example, you look at the Battle of Manzikert, Alparslan, the Seljuk commander, knotted his horse's tail as a sign he was to go into battle. So in this seal of the Hungarian prince in the late 13th century, you still find this typical steppes tradition in what was a chiefly military martial context, right? And this picture is very interesting because the prince also has a flat-topped great helm, which is of typical Germany at this point. The mail coif, which is visible at his neck, and he also carries a flat-topped, almost triangular shield that is also typical of 13th century European evolution of the weaponry, because essentially with the spread of plate armor, the typically kind of drop-shaped shield was progressively during these centuries shortened and to become just a tiny triangle essentially, and would grow smaller and eventually even disappear at some point towards the 15th century. And also, other typical thing, the prince holds his lance in the couché manner, right? So naturally, we don't have to be extremely dogmatic about lances, grips on horseback, because literally in all times in history, knights have done literally everything all the time with it. Right, saying at this time that knights fought only by charging with the couché, lance, grip. Yet they didn't do only that. They did preferably that when it was convenient to do so in the typical shock charge and thickly compact formation, but they would do many other things with it, because that's not the only type of combat that exists, by the way. And this is truer perhaps in Hungary, right? That still has to fully, maybe, has now fully absorbed the Western military capability, but it still has this side tradition that partly survives, and that these guys are very likely used to as well, because especially the aristocracy would be trained always to fight in every kind of way. So this influences, whether domestic or external, due to more ethnic tradition, are still there, and these guys still know how to fight like that. There are other depictions in some reliefs about Hungarian knights with full mail halberds and shawls, and also long straight swords hung from a broadsword belt. Like the traditional pretty long swords were from Germany, also famous, the Grande Épée d'Allemagne, as they were called in French, and it's possible that they fit also in the Hungarian tradition at one point by Western influence. And there are other depictions of certain types of large shields. We don't understand whether, it's rare, but kind of a circular shield, we don't understand it's a typical Hungarian thing. I don't think so. It's just a case, but we don't know whether it's domestic or foreign in this regard. We have also a coin of King Andrew II of Hungary, between 1205 and 35, that shows a man with this long, flat-topped, kite-shaped shield and a straight sword, right? And then we also have a coin of King Bela IV, between 1235 and 1270. Bela holds a spear rather than a sword, and his shield in common with the changing style of those found in mid and late 13th century Europe, in shorter and more triangular in shape, as we've seen before. So this is what concerns the substantially Magyar or Hungarian at this point, kind of more traditional influence. Right, let's pass to the kind of more Slavic one, that also is, as we've seen, one of the major components in here, but built the same Hungarian identity, largely. And we have certain arrowheads from Castelli, Hungary, dated to the 11th, 13th century. These are large socket-type arrowheads, coming from the essentially western end of the Lake Balaton. Right, this area had retained a Slav character and a Slav minority into the Middle Ages, and these minorities generally, as we have seen, survived in the hillier areas where the originally nomadic Magyars dominated the wide plains. Right, it was since the time of the conquest. We have also possible fragments of a helmet from XIII in Slovakia, from the 12th, maybe early 13th century, which is at the Archaeological Institute of Nitra, Slovakia. And we don't clearly understand. It's an iron object that looks massive, maybe too much to be an actual helmet. And its plume at that point would have been almost 3 centimeters across, so pretty big, but it could have been, however, the top of an early form of great helm, right? And its construction is riveted, and it kind of recalls the great Polish type of helmet, and the object could have been also part of a lantern. We don't clearly understand this, but it's nevertheless interesting, shows possible connection even with Polish area. It was actually pretty close, and it did interact with, it bordered and interacted with Hungary as well. Then we have a sword from Hungary dated to the mid-13th century at the National Museum of Budapest, which is very similar to other ones that have been found in Slovakia. And these were all probably made in Germany. That around the area was basically the main area from which they imported blades, but also possibly in Bohemia. We don't really know. There is this other sword from Deha nad Váhom in Slovakia, which is from the late 12th, early 13th century, always in the Archaeological Institute of Nitra. And it's a typically Central European type of sword, and was probably made in the Rhineland for export. Right, the blades were somewhat longer than previous times, more slender with thrusting points, right, and also much narrower fullers. This grooves down in the mid of the blade. They were known as Blutrinne in German, because blood had theoretically to pour along them, but doesn't make any sense. They were actually for balancing the blade, and sometimes they were extended to 2/3 of the actual weapon's length, like in this example. There are other arrowheads in Slovakia at the Považské Museum in Žilina in Slovakia. These are datable between the 12th and the 14th century, and they come from central Slovakia proper, that in a region of mountains and narrow valleys that effectively the Magyars never settled in, right? And anyhow, from two of these arrowheads are of the tanked type with diamond-shaped heads we encountered before, that placed them firmly within the steppe horse archery tradition. And it's possible that they were used actually by a local Hungarian, Magyar, or even Cuman garrison, and it can also indicate the spread of Hungarian archery technology to Slav areas such as Slovakia, right? And other arrowheads in the same find actually show the sockets and barbs that are within the Western archery tradition as well. So it's a hybrid context in here. Then there's a sword from late 13th century Slovakia. It's at the Danubian Museum of Komárno in Slovakia, which is a perfect example of an Hungarian sword of the time that actually was perfectly European, right, without any steppes, influence, etc. And that shows that, in fact, what we've seen before, that by the late 13th century now, this Western traditions had been fully included and had become also prevalent. And there's also another sword from Trenčín in Slovakia from the late 13th, early 14th century. And though longer and narrower than other similarly dated weapons, this sword has a relatively thick blade, clearly intended for thrusting, and designed to counter newly adopted plate armor as well. This is very interesting, also because the Hungarians weren't fighting exactly at that point against the Germans as well, in Austria, etc. And therefore, those were areas where there was a lot of plate armor emerging, right? So this can reflect a structural adaptation to that, as well as an adoption of the same armor from the same Hungarians, by the way. There's another sword from Hungary dated to the 13th or early 14th century at the National Museum of Budapest, and it's actually a set of swords and shows a different variety of forms, including some similar to the ones seen in Slovakia. And this shows actually a very high degree of military uniformity across the Hungarian kingdom, both the central areas dominated by the Magyar element and the northern part of the more Slavic character. Then there's another sword from Mijava in Slovakia, dated to the mid-13th century. It's at the Slovak National Museum of Martin, Slovakia. And what is interesting is the crossguard, this sword that is reminiscent of some seen on the statues in the Naumburg Cathedral in Germany. And this was imported from Germany as well, like most Slovakian swords, as a matter of fact. So very direct influence in this area dominated by the Hungarian kings that also has so much German influence. Now there are some axes dated to 13th, 14th century Hungary, preserved at the National Museum of Budapest. These are actually two axes, and they're both very different from each other, but also from the narrow-bladed form seen above, the one that we thought was for maybe of actual of Eastern Slavonic influence, maybe designed for mounted combat. And this is really amazing because actually one finds parallels nonetheless that in the Northern European Danish axis of an earlier period, the ones from Viking era substantially. So one may wonder, like, of course these weapons were present elsewhere, but it's still amazing how similar they are, right, to the ones of the Danish tradition. The other one actually is more similar to certain Polish weapons at the same time. So this northern influence in axis coming both from the Germanic and Slavic world, impressive, really impressive. Especially considering that we're talking about fairly late times, by the way, the 13th, 14th century, which can be explained through the essentially to the spread of the coat of plates, for which these blunt weapons were also more massive weapons, telling the truth, could be useful for, like, as can openers, we can say. Which were a real thing, right? And these weapons, especially the first one, is not, however, to be meant as used on horseback, I think, because you can't use double-handed weapon on horseback, but this still could be used by an elite, really. So even this could be the same mounted knights that when dismounting could use these weapons as well, and surely were trained, however, how to use them anyway. Then finally, for what concerns this kind of other largely Slavic influences, there are spearheads from Slovakia dated to the 12th, 14th century at a local museum of Trenčín in Slovakia. And the dating, as you understand, is fairly conjectural, and one is strongly built, and it's probably designed to penetrate armor. The other is dedicated to ceremonial functions, probably, and it's interesting that it's similar actually to certain weapons from the Baltic regions as well. So it seems here towards the 13th century we do have some influences coming even from the north, which is fascinating because, the Hungary wasn't particularly involved, as you know, in the northern areas, but other neighboring countries were, because like the Germans, the Bohemians, the St. Pauls would participate wildly to the Baltic areas where there were also Scandinavians, etc. So these heavier, more massive swords, weapons that seem to have had also a kind of a anti-armor function are interesting to be observed also in Hungary at the same time, as if more or less people began to circulate from these areas as well. So thirdly and lastly, but also with a kind of a substantial information, I would like to talk about the Cuman influence that was really big at this time, right? Since the 11th century, and especially in the 13th, there was all these populations pouring in Hungary and settling down, bringing their military traditions with them. So there is a saber, typical cavalry, and especially at this time of steppes weapon, dated to the 12th, 13th century from Hungary at the Military Museum of Budapest. And this was used by one of the Kuns, so-called Kuns, that were essentially this broader name to which the Hungarians actually called the Turkish Pechenegs, like also later the Cumans, right? and these people maintained essentially a transhumant pastoral way of life comparable to that of the original Magyars. So it's as if the Hungarian kings had kept having this stock of originally ethnic cavalrymen leaving the old custom, right? More militarized in nature, essentially, because those were more readily active for war, for loot. These were essentially looters. They were used fundamentally like this. They were harassing enemy lines with bows and arrows, and then essentially retreating, leaving room for the heavier shock cavalry, and then hopefully pillaging the enemy camp in the meanwhile, like they always did, and were fairly unreliable as well, telling the truth, even for the same Hungarians. And the interesting thing is that this saber is very long and slender, and it seems to be typically Turco-Mongol in type, right? And albeit it has kind of an uncharacteristically long crossguard that can be developed following maybe the Cuman settlement in Hungary, which is kind of interesting. Then there is an axe head dated to 11th to 13th century Hungary, preserved at the National Museum of Budapest. And this is a relatively light and narrow-bladed axe found in many parts of Eastern and Central Europe. And as we've seen, it's similar to certain types used in the Eurasian steppes, and we don't know where this tradition in there actually began. We could think that this types of swords were present in the Pannonian Plain since the times of the Hunnic invasions. Maybe it had been the Avars or the same Magyars who had brought them. It was kind of characteristic at this point of the area. Then we have certain helmets of possible Iranian or Mongol origin, dated to 12th, 13th century Hungary, preserved at the National Museum of Budapest. And their origin is quite captivating because there's this exquisite surface decoration on the helmet, and it combines Islamic metalwork with fanciful birds of Central Asian origin. Right? It's from a broad area that, however, was at the time pretty military advanced, and probably produced weapons for selling because there is no trace of any Arabic inscription, right, which makes, in theory, Islamic origin unlikely. Unless, in fact, this helmet was made specifically for export, right? In other words, these were Islamic workshops somewhere in Central Asia or even in the Middle East that sold this stuff, and they didn't engrave anything like in Arabic on it because they knew that they would have to be sold to foreigners, might have not even been capable of reading that, or that were not even Islamic, and that would have not bought it otherwise. So this was probably, possibly at least, dedicated for export, right? Otherwise, this decoration, and especially the small peak at the front of the helmet, could suggest a 13th century Mongol origin at the time of the invasion of Hungary, which makes it perhaps even more fascinating. Then there are arrowheads from Slovakia, dated to the 13th to the 15th century. We don't know concretely where it came from. Rutke wrote about this, and they represent probably the end of the influence of steppes archery techniques in Slovakia. Right? Slovakia was partly encompassed by the properly major influence, locally speaking, and it's a well-made set of arrowheads made in the typical tank type armor-piercing style that we have seen before, and this could be as well as from other peoples that came in the area alongside with the Hungarians during even the occupation, etc. So it's fascinating. Then we have gold mountings of a sword belt of Kipchak origin, dated to the 13th century. These come from the National Museum of Budapest, and this is what is fascinating about it. They were found at a Kipchak site, but it was an entirely European belt in design, terrific. Like, you find this all the time, actually, but people never think about it. But it may seem strange that you can find all these terrific ethnic mixes in equipment of all sort. And this means that the same Kipchak, especially the elite, might have gradually adopted Western techniques themselves, because technically these Cumans were to be settled down at one point, right? They were transformed into farmers themselves, just as it had happened to the Magyars, right? After some time. Otherwise, it could be meaning another thing, that one of these Cumans was actually entrusted with the status of knight, essentially as a chieftain by his Hungarian overlords, and therefore he had accepted knighthood, and therefore obtaining this belt, the Cingulum Militaris, right, saying, okay, you're a knight, we recognize you like a peer of the Hungarian aristocracy, but okay, this guy would still live like a Cuman, essentially, which is possible at the same time. Especially given that it's not a weapon proper, like it's just a part of the gear. Then there is an helmet, which is Cuman, dated to the 13th century, National Museum of Budapest. It is kind of low-domed, and it's basically made from one piece of iron plus a plume holder, or a funnel, and a deep reinforcing rim. And it was used by one of those warriors who escaped the Mongol invasion and took refuge in Hungary from the Ukraine. And what is fascinating about it the most probably is that it's clearly related stylishly and structurally to various Iranian helmets proper, right? Because the Cumans, by the way, weren't just, people say, they were Turkish, essentially Turkic. Well, it doesn't mean much, because from the steps you can even be whatever, like you can be, I don't know, speaking Turkic but being of Indo-European ancestry, or it's actually both things at the same, or vice versa, and it's actually both things at the same time in those cases. And there are influences, in fact, from these Iranian populations that the same Cumans were in part being made up by. Then we have spearheads from the 13th century Kipchaks that have strong sockets, and in some cases very narrow blades. That means that an armored enemy was expected to be engaged. Then we have mace heads, always from Kipchak origin, from the 13th century. These are always still at the National Museum of Budapest, right? And these are, once again, relatively small mace heads that are essentially the same we have depicted before in the Hungarian tradition. And we don't know whether they were adopted by the Kipchaks from the Magyars, or whether they spread because of the arrival of Kipchaks in Hungary. We don't really know. But it's still interesting that there is this cross, this spread between Eastern Slavs, Ugar Finns, and Turkic and Iranian populations that make use of these weapons. Think about always the mace is the spear, is the weapon of command, right? It's ideally the fact that the fear that every freeman is a sort of nobleman of sort, and that it has to prove by attacking the enemy kind of close range, not with a blade or a spear that attacks at distance, right? But just going there, smashing against him in his armor, because that makes it even bolder, right? But this mace heads are, in this sense, are quite symbolic, because they don't seem to have any particular type of traumatic impact that could compete with the heavier armor, right? But it still survived, probably with this idea of status, or at least of style, in fashion, in that key. Then there is this one is very important, and we hinted at it before. Basically, we have some fragments of a mail shirt with shoulder plates plus gold-mounted sword belt, right? This is Kipchak from the 13th century. it's at the National Museum of Budapest too. Now, we don't really know how the mail shirt was done, because it was smashed and completely fused, and so we can't reconstruct how it was structured. It was possibly small and perhaps similar to examples that have been found in the Ukraine. But the most interesting part of it is that it included a pair of shoulder protecting plates, known as épaulettes, eventually in French, which, it could be potentially important in the sense that the epaulette would develop in the Western armor at beginning, essentially in the 14th century, right? So this thing is from the 13th. So there could be, hypothetically, a connection between the introduction of shoulder plates, as it would happen in 14th century Europe, from this Cuman and Hungarian channel, right? Because if this was a Cuman thing, and we find it in Hungary eventually, and we find it eventually in Western Europe the century afterwards, it could as well be that in this sense Hungary was a medium for kind of developing this kind of better protections that could have been actually that are actually very similar, for sure, to Turco-Mongol body armor plates. And this could mean and reinforce as well that thesis according to which, in fact, part of plate armor, the coat of plate, would be introduced in Europe because of this contact with this traumatic contact with the Mongols, and their military technology and their equipment, right? Especially in anti-missile fashion. For what concerns the gold belt mounts found with this male hauberk, well, these are typically European sword belts. So this makes it ever more fascinating, because it means not just that there could be an influence from east to west, but also to west to east, and that exactly countries like Hungary were and probably Hungary more than others, right? Maybe just Russia, but Russia in that sense didn't, with the Mongol invasion, is cut off from the west, even from the Western Slavs, that were the easternmost to Russia. Instead, Hungary maintains, and very closely so, contact with areas like Germany, like Italy, that, by the way, are also selling armor in Hungary, and they would keep doing that. So Hungary could be actually the perfect point of passage in areas like Central Europe of these kind of Turco-Mongol armor styles that seem to have possibly influenced the development of the coat of plate in the same Western tradition, which is really amazing. You also have Kipchak Arrowheads from the 13th century, National Museum, Budapest, and there's a mixture essentially of arrowheads that indicate that the Cumans took some ideas, or at least some available arrows, from their predecessors in Hungary. So once again, here Hungary, rather than being influenced by these steppes peoples, was effectively more influencing them also in turn. And in fact, at least 10 of these arrowheads are Western or Slav socket type. The reminders are of the tanged type of the steppes, and two other arrows, one with a tang and one with a socket, are found with the broad barbed type that is usually associated with Western styles of archery. So we have a complete melting pot of military traditions in this case. And what is fascinating, it's not even Hungary. I mean, it's Hungary, but it's the Cuman community. So this is really incredible in many ways, and I think it can really tell a lot about the 13th century, which is, of course, a moment of great distress in the area because of the Mongol invasion, but that's exactly what probably made functioning and stimulated so many changes and brought to sensible modifications to these armaments, and even contributed to spread them further into the Western tradition from the steppes via Hungary, right? Alright, and so I think this is what we could tell about the, generally speaking, about not maybe the 13th century Hungarian cavalry, but the concept here is that if you find all of these weapons and you talk about the military elite, the mounted elite, the armored elite, you know that these guys essentially used all of this stuff. So it's not anecdotal to actually list these influences, because there were so many different types of troops serving in the Hungarian army. It was definitely multi-ethnical at this time. Like, there's never been, and this is the impression I get, we will see it better, we're talking about the Hungarian army organization at this time, there's not actually a clearly, especially at this time, a clearly, like, national army of Hungary. Like, normally other countries like have a core of, you know, national troops that are levied locally, and then a set of mercenaries, right? Hungary is really a melting pot, right? There was a brutal political struggle in this regard. There were also many peoples within the same boundaries of Hungary, and that's also what contributed to the struggle. And probably, especially when we're talking about the monarchic the royal military expeditions, let's say, it's more likely, as we've seen, that the king would rely, I can't say more preferably on the foreigners, but tendentially, however, trying to get support from those communities that were adverse to the ethnic nobility that was usually adverse to him. And so this is the concept here, and it's fascinating, because I think as a result we have actually more influence, we have more evidence of this kind of let's say foreign influence than of the actual Hungarian tradition, which we know still existed. It's difficult to track it, especially in this sea of different communities of different peoples, and it's very, very interesting, and we will have definitely to talk a lot more about Hungarian warfare, because it's dramatically fascinating, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Because of that. So, okay, I think this is all for it. I hope you appreciate it, and if you did, please share this video, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time.